Hello, my name's Gemma, and I work at Calderdale Museums, and that includes Shibden Hall, which hopefully you're all quite familiar with as we are at a Anne Lister Summit. I've been working at Calder Museums now for 1 year, and it's been a fabulous experience working there and getting to know all about Shibden Hall and also Anne Lister. And part of our collection at Bankfield Museum is a fabulous collection of textiles. And I come from a fashion history background. So this presentation today that I'll be talking about came out of a talk I did for the Anne Lister Festival a couple of months ago at the beginning of the year, talking about the layers of clothing and what is involved in fashions from specifically the 1830s of what an upper class woman would have worn. And so very kindly got approached by the summit to do a similar presentation. And I've slightly tweaked it to look at mentions in Anne Lister's diaries about certain items of clothing as well. So originally this presentation involved me getting changed, but that's a little bit tricky to do on a virtual platform. So I've filmed a little wee video which is going to be played in a couple of seconds, which shows the layers of getting dressed. And then I'll be going into more depth about them. And bonus points if anyone knows where it's being filmed. So I'll pass over to Marlene, who's going to pop the little video up now, and then we'll come back. So hopefully you now have a bit more of an understanding about how a woman got dressed and how those garments look and shape the body. So if you give me 2 seconds, I'm just now going to share my screen with the presentation. So a little bit of background first. This period is known as the Romantic. So coming out of the Regency and sort of overlapping the Victorian period, roughly the first half of the century. So Romanticism emphasized emotion and appreciation for the beauty of nature, largely a reactionary response to the booming industrialization going on at the time. And we see this romanticism in fashion, which explodes in more than ways than one from the mid 1820s. So this slide shows the changing silhouette from the early 1800s Regency shape, which has a very high bust and columnar skirt, to the 1830s, where skirts and sleeves sort of balloon out. And then as we go into the 1840s, you see wider skirts, but longer bodices with pointed fronts and shaped tight sleeves. But what's going on underneath these layers? So the first layer is a chemise, and this hasn't changed for centuries. It's a very simple construction overall, a simple T shape with a low neckline that could be gathered, and sometimes a flap which folded over the corset and low set sleeves. The neckline was loose and the undergarment was gusseted, which allowed for greater movement. And the picture here on the screen is an excerpt from the Workwoman's Guide, and it gives a couple of the patterns that would have been used to make a chemise. The next layer is a pair of stays. So this is pre the iconic Victorian corset with a cinched waist. We call these foundation garments stays. They're made of cotton or linen with structuring from cording and boning. The mid-1820s to 1830s sees the long stays coming more widely worn, moving on from the short stays of the earlier Regency period. In the middle of these stays was a busk, which could have been worn made from bone or wood, and it gave a flat line at the front. It sort of held the stomach in, and it separated and helped lift the bust. As the waistlines began to drop at this period of time, the focus became on the waist, and it wanted to be more defined and cinched, but it was never tight-laced. That's a myth thanks to film and TV. But this is where we start to get that definition of a waist and the shaping of a pair of stays, where you get gussets over the hips and you also start to get a lot of support around the bust. So stays do appear a lot in Anne Lister's diaries. She frequently buys stays for other female friends, especially when she's in Paris. Friends come over and try on her French stays, which must have been something quite special back then. And we get many lines of her changing her stays, and this is usually before dinner. So much like we would change our own bras for a different outfit, you put your fancy bra on when you're going out for dinner. Exactly the same sort of principle here. They would have changed. And because it's an item so close to your skin, it would have wanted to be changed more because you're sweating and you're going through them a little bit more. So I found this entry in her diary because it's a really interesting one that talks about the boning in her stays. So stays from a foundation aspect gave support to the bust, but also just the waist. And this could have been through boning. It was a lot lighter than the boning you get in the Victorian period. And then you would have had cording. So cording's when you have two stitched channels between two layers of fabric and then a piece of cord through the middle of it. So that can also provide quite a decorative element to them. This slide has plucked out a couple of entries from Anne's diary, and I thought it was really interesting because it tracks the process of getting fitted for a pair of stays by a stay maker in Paris called Madame Delacroix. And we see that Madame visits her at her accommodation to fit her. Then there's another fitting, and it sort of tracks how many days it took to make a pair of stays. And then a girl from Madame Calais, which was part of the Decroix staymaker's business, comes and fits them. I do find it interesting though, because They didn't quite fit her, so she made her take 9 off, which sort of says a lot about Lister. She was quite the bargainer. So the next layer is petticoats, and they wore a lot of petticoats. You needed a lot to get that bell shape. So the first petticoat normally was a corded petticoat, and this is where you get the volume. You would have seen in the video that it sort of gives the most amount of structure and width. So similar to the cording that was used in stays. And these were also heavily stiffened with a starch, to the point where sometimes they can stand up on themselves. They're that voluminous with the starch. The practical side of petticoats was warmth. It was also a washable layer. So if it picked up the mud and the dirt, you could then wash it quite easily. It held your skirts out of the way of your legs, but it also had a modesty aspect where it was still holding the skirt. Drawers aren't quite as popular yet. So except for stockings, you're not wearing much underneath. So the petticoat covered and protected the legs. In winter, you see a lot of quilted petticoats or stuffed petticoats. And think of it a bit like the quilt on your bed. It's like that, but as a skirt. And so it provided a really lovely warm layer and again helped hold out those skirts, achieving that really iconic bell shape. So there's many references to petticoats and undergarments, but I found this one really interesting, and it gave a fascinating link between Yorkshire and the worsted manufacturing industry and also the woolen industry in Australia, which is where I'm from. And so I thought this was a really nice one to mention. So Australia started producing merino wool in the late 1790s, and Reverend Samuel Marsden brought some wool back with him to the UK in 1807 for commercial use. He then founded major industries of Australian wool and worsted wool mills around Yorkshire. So the 1830s saw a significant expansion of merino wool, nicknamed the merino craze, and you see this in America but also in the UK. And by this time, Australia had a flock of nearly 2 million merino sheep. By the 1880s, Bradford was known as Worcestopolis for its production of worsted wool, and a lot of that being Australian merino. So merino was a very popular fabric choice for undergarments, but also for winter dresses and outer garments. So we see Anne Lister talking about her merinos. It's a bit tricky to tell whether she's talking about putting on her merino undergarments, so that could have been merino wool drawers or long johns, or something, the early version of like a utility suit. But she also wears merino shawls, and she has pelisses made out of merino. So for example, this one, her green merino shawl that she showed to Madame de Camp. Sleeves. This is the most wonderful part of the 1830s, the sleeves. So we get the nickname of a leg of mutton sleeve, but they were also more normally known at the time as a guigeot sleeve. So guigeot is the French word for the back leg of an animal, especially that of a lamb or sheep. And the guigeot sleeve was named for its resemblance to a sheep's hind leg, so wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. In the 1830s, the sleeve was low and set off the shoulder. The fullness was very low and quite droopy and tapered into a tightly fitted sleeve at the wrist. Unlike the 1890s, the 1830s sleeve is much droopier and the line doesn't extend above the shoulder. So for anyone who is looking at historical fashions or fashion plates, that's a really good indication of 30s versus 90s massive sleeves. And it wasn't as full of a balloon rounded shape. It was a little bit softer, but still pretty extreme. This sleeve is monstrous. It takes a minimum of about 2.5 yards of material, and it's often made on the bias. So that's using up even more material, let alone if you want to have it long sleeved and extra accoutrements added to it. And the sleeves are quite a clever trick, because when you combine the massive sleeve, the massive skirts, the humongous hair, the huge bonnets, the waist suddenly looks really small. So it's a bit of an optical illusion. But how are these sleeves supported? So there are two main types of sleeve supports. There's a pillow-like one, which is on the top, and then there's a more caged bone style, which is the one down the bottom. So the pillowed ones were stuffed with feather or down or wool fibres. You even get examples of ones using leftover rags from other dresses and projects. And the caged ones look quite a bit like a lantern, and they're lighter than the pillow ones, and they can collapse. So they're quite often used for transport because you could collapse them down and they're a bit easier to store. And then the structured channels could be made out of boning, but also cane. So if you moisten cane and you form it onto a circular shape, it holds that shape. And that's what they used quite often in here. So the sleeve plumper then had strings, which you can see on both of these examples, and these were tied into either the shoulder strap of the stays or into the bodice. And so in the video that I showed of me getting dressed, I had them tied into the sleeves of my bodice. But quite often the sleeves or bodices were interchangeable. And again, Anne Lister does record a lot of the time setting in a new set of sleeves into my pelisse. And that's because the sleeves are an item that tends to attract a lot of dirt and movement and wear. So you were also able to change them, but you could also change them with different accents and lace and various decorations. So I did find a very interesting little snippet from Anne Lister's diary on the subject of fashions. So though London imitates as well as she can, large rooms and folding doors are necessary nowadays, quite necessary, for sleeves are so enormous that each lady's breadth across the shoulders is doubled. Pelerines very large, much worn, with longer and shorter ends confined by the ceinture in front. So a pelerine is like a little cape or a capelet that you can see on this fashion plate here, which is from a similar period of time to when this journal entry was written. And again, you can see that the breadth of those sleeves. You can fit through doors though, because it does sort of squish, except at Shibden, where the doors are incredibly low and very tight. And then you do have to sort of do a bit of a sideways dance, especially because I'm on a little bit taller and bonnets don't quite fit. I really love some of the satirical prints that you get from the 1830s. And it shows that, yes, it was a ridiculous fashion and they were making fun of themselves as well. So this is inflating a lady, which is sort of laughing at the giant sleeves that you get. But the poor maid, you look at her massive hat and then the lady's hair, and there's all these added double entendres about the satirical nature of this fashion. And this one's another one. So another satirical print looking at the ridiculousness of the fashions. But you can see how that sort of sweet spot of the waist looks really, really narrow. Another aspect about fashions of this period of time is the hems were quite short, and you could actually see the full ankle. And whilst that was considered a horror to the men writing in newspapers, for a lady, it's really nice actually, because it means you've got a bit of movement and you don't have to hitch your skirts up all the time. So I got asked about hats, and that was something I wanted to look at a little bit in this presentation. And some of the headwear that Anne Lister mentions in her diary and the hats that were popular at the time. So the bonnet really took over the hat in the 1830s for women, and especially by the 1840s, it's just about the only hat that is worn. And this is where bonnets and hats also grow to excessive proportions with lavish trims. So very roughly, a bonnet is a softer head covering with a crown and a side brim shaped and extending over the head, usually tied under the chin. So I've got examples of bonnets here on the screen on the left, and you can see that crown where it's not like a hat where the crown goes all the way around, it's sort of more shaped at the front and normally tied underneath the chin. But this definition gets a bit skewed as you go into the later Victoria period, where the bow underneath the chin tends to become more decorative. Hats are a more rigid head covering. They're worn by both genders, and it has a crown, but the brim is usually all the way round in a circle and positioned on top of the head directly rather than sort of behind. And you also get turbans and you get various other different types of hats and headwear at this period of time. But you can see here on the right a more hat style headpiece, again with fabulous trimmings, bows and fripperies. So indoors, you would have worn a cap. And these could have been heavily embellished with ruffles, lace, embroidery. Around this period of time, we start to see long lappets extending down the neck and over the shoulder. And these were all really decorative elements. So this is Portrait of Auntie Anne, and it's a really fabulous example of those frilly caps. So whilst they were decorative and quite silly, they were protective as well. They had a purpose. So they protected their hair from oils. You're not washing your hair as much and you're tending to use a lot of powders. So if you have your bonnet on, you would usually have a little frilly cap on underneath. A leghorn bonnet is one of the bonnets that Anne Lister mentions wearing. And this is a very popular type of bonnet at the period of time, and it refers to a type of straw that came from Leghorn or Livorno in Tuscany, where bonnets and component pieces were made. They were incredibly popular from about 1817 into the 1840s, and it was a very specific type of straw, a very fine straw that was bleached this pale colour. And it became incredibly popular and exported across the country, and especially in France and in England, these were really popular, and they're often just referred to as my leghorn bonnet. And so another fabulous little mention in this excerpt of Anne Lister's diaries is her false hair. And so a really popular hairstyle with these masses of ringlets at the front. And you would often make them out of false hair. So that could be horsehair or other person's hair. You collect your own hair and you would make these and you would set them on ribbons and tie them on. And this has been done for hundreds of years, women using fake hair to volumize, but also to become quite fashionable. Here we have nearly an entire outfit recorded by Anne Lister. So I never feel as if I was properly dressed. I wore dress silk stockings and black satin shoes, my new black moire, that is watered silk morning gown, my watered silk white bonnet, with my 3 ostrich feathers put into it for the occasion. All that was very well, as also the blonde frill around my throat that Madame de Cunt made me this morning. So this is a great little snippet of nearly an entire outfit. And I've chosen these 2 fashion plates on either side. So the one on the left shows a bonnet with these giant ostrich frills, so ostrich feathers. So maybe that's what her bonnet would have looked like. And then this dress on the right comes from a couple of months later from this diary entry, but it's a very fashionable outfit made of black. So it's a morning walking dress. And we know Anne Lister only wore black from this period of time. But it's interesting that she pairs it with a white bonnet. And moire silk is a really popular type of material at this time. It has this lovely watered translucent pattern that's almost iridescent, and it would have looked quite magnificent when worn. And then a blonde frill, that's a type of lace. Now, I'm not too sure if this is just a little extra piece of lace that's been added or it's a chemisette. So a chemisette is a bit like, if anyone knows, in the 50s, 60s, the little dickies that you had were like an insert collar. So it's like that, it's a little insert, and often they had these fabulous little ruffs that you can see in both of these fashion plates here. So we know Anne Lister wore a range of bonnets and hats. Interestingly, she doesn't stick to black. And it's a little bit hard to differentiate sometimes what she means by bonnet, hat, because she kind of uses them interchangeably. But there is a few times when ladies would have worn a men's hat, and that is when they were out riding. So a habit is a very specific type of garment that's worn when you're riding, and this would have been paired with a top hat, very similar to a man's top hat. And you would have had a long veil to protect the face from mud and dirt. And we can see a few examples here where Anne Lister is recorded. So speaking of travelling dress, so this could have been dress to wear when riding in the carriage, which again was a whole separate outfit. You had outfits for every occasion. And then you also had your habit. So with a black beaver hat, so that's beaver fur, and one pelisse. So a pelisse is sort of like an overcoat or a jacket. And a habit, oh, hold on, to read the rest of the coat, sorry. Faces are in the way. A habit would require a beaver, and the dress would not be odd because a regular English dress, but could not wear a beaver with a pelisse. That would be odd. So I love these little elements where she's talking about what's fashionable and what's not, and it gives a really interesting indication of what she was thinking, but also what was fashionable at that time. And I'll end this brief bit of the presentation on this fabulous satirical print of an exhibition, and you can see the men are lamenting the fact that they can't actually sing anything because of all the women's hats are in the way. And this is where I'm going to show you a couple of little items, and then we will open up to questions. So if you have some questions, please ask. But I wanted to show you some of the items. So these are a sleeve plumper, which I have made using a pattern from the Workwoman's Guide. So you've got these really, really tight gathers here. And then you can see how that has then created this pillow-like effect. And then you've got the armband, and that's what goes on and secures. And then you also have the caged ones. So you can see how they sort of deflate, and then you can pack them, and then you give them a bit of a tug and they sort of pop up. So these ones, it's the same pattern piece as the pillow ones, but you can see how it's got these 3 stitching channels, and then boning that have been put into it, and that's what gives it that sort of accordion-like shape. These I tend to wear if I'm doing some evening wear, because when you're dancing, they tend to squish and have a little bit more movement, whereas these you do tend to bounce off people. And then another element is the bonnet, just to show you a little bit of the construction. So really iconic of the 1830s is this massive crown. There is absolutely no practical benefit to these massive crowns, well, particularly in this bonnet. It doesn't protect from the sun, but it does look fabulous. And so this is made of a material called buckram. And buckram is a bit like hessian, but quite stiff. And it's got an open weave. And you use 2 layers and you cross-hatch them. So you have buckram that way. And it creates quite a fused shape. And then you have domette, which is a bit like flannel, and so you put that on top and then underneath, and then you have the silk layer, and you could have it fanned or you could have it flat, and then you would put lots and lots of trimmings on it as well. And so the way that this hat sits is when you have quite a high bun, it just sort of perches on top. And what's nice is you don't always need to have a hat pin, and it does function quite well with the ribbons. So now I thought I'd leave lots of times for questions, because I always think they're really interesting, and we can talk more if you have any questions to ask me, and it can sort of go on to different tracks. So I'll I believe someone was going to ask the questions out. Brilliant.
So if anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat. But to start with, we have a question from Sari, which is, do we know from Anne Lister's diaries if Anne used all of these items or just some of them? Or did she amend some of them to fit her taste? Or did she use the large sleeves as well, for example?
I haven't found anything specific about her wearing large sleeves. She does mention sleeves a lot. She does at one point complain about amount of fabric that it uses up. Uh, when she's in France, she does get a lot of garments made for her, and they are up-to-date fashions. And she talks about that because she also shares messages with Marianne about what the fashions were in Paris that she was seeing. So she did have quite a fashionable look by the looks of it. And then something I have started doing is compiling lists of the items that she mentioned. So all the items I mentioned, she would have worn at some point in time, especially the undergarments, because they were interchangeable. Much like we all wear knickers and bras now, they all wore a chemise. Women would have worn stays, and Lissa does also mention wearing drawers, because Shibden, if anyone's been there in the winter, it's freezing. So you need those undergarment layers.
Nice. So, next question is from Liza, and it's how much volume did working women's dresses have during this time? Were there any illusions or hacks they employed to sort of emulate the silhouette worn by a more wealthy woman than to use more material than was actually used?
Yeah, so this period of time, there is a little bit of, I don't want to use the word, but it kind of fits, of egalitarianism in terms of fashion. So it's the first time that we get the emerging middle class being able to afford and wear fashionable dress. And they would have had elements of fashionable dress. And we see that, for example, in the Bronte sisters, who are not incredibly wealthy. They are more of that sort of upper middle class. And we know that they wore dresses with quite voluminous sleeves and wide skirts. So much like we do now, you see what's on the catwalk and what celebrities are wearing and what really, really wealthy people are wearing. And it trickles down, and we adopt fashionable elements of that within what we can't afford. Another fabulous thing about this period of time is the manufacturing of cloth. It's becoming cheaper, and you are able to afford cloth a little bit more readily. And also patterns and availability to make items is starting to come out as well. You also get fashion plates. So these are ladies' magazines. Think of like Vogue of the time, where you have these very fashionable outfits, and you can go, oh, I want to make that, and you'll make a version of what you can. In terms of working wear, we do get mentions in journals and newspapers for factories of factory owners getting really, really cross at women for wearing fashionable dress. And especially as we get into like the 1850s, when you start to get whopping great crinolines. And they got quite annoyed of women wearing fashionable dress because it took up room, but it also caused issues with machinery. So women would have had a slightly less voluminous sleeve, though it would have been slightly more deflated. They might have had less of a full skirt. One of the really cool things about skirts at this time is they're so simple to make. It's literally a rectangle gathered. It's not panelled. It's not until later into the later 19th century that we start to get gored or panelled skirts. So they're really actually quite easy to make.
Thank you. This question actually sort of relates back to the first one about Anne sort of yeah, amending things to fit kind of how she wanted to look. But questions from Gabriella, and it says, in all the portraits we have of Anne from different periods of her life, she's never wearing quite as much volume or doesn't seem to be as fashionable as other women. Could this perhaps be a way for her to differentiate herself from the gender norms imposed on women where she perhaps didn't feel comfortable?
Yeah, probably. But also, she's a very practical woman. She's not sitting around by the fireplace sewing. So the dress that she's wearing, it needs movement, and it needs to be a bit more practical. So I think that had a massive influence. My interpretation, and this is me having only read her diaries in like the last year and being very, very new to it, is that she had a very fashion forward focus, but tended to be a bit more practical of what she wore on it more every day. So she refers to her old coat a lot and her old straw hat. But then when she does go out, she seems very conscious of being fashionable, because she probably didn't want to stick out too much like a sore thumb. So I think there are elements of fashionable dress that she would have adopted, much like us today, what's fashionable now is not necessarily what you're wearing, but in 40 years' time, you'll look back at that and go, oh my God, that was so of that era. Much like I look back at what I wore in the early 2000s. I'm like, oh my God, that was that. Why did I wear that? So you still get elements of that fashionable dress that you don't even realize that you're wearing. I hope that answers in some way.
Yeah, I hope so. So we've got another question from Gabrielle, which is, do you have any books to recommend that focus on particularly 1830s fashion?
There's nothing specific about 1830s fashion as much, but there are a couple of really good books. There's one called How to Read a Dress, which is by Lydia Edwards, and that's a really great surface level document about all periods of fashion. And she also does one about suits. Hold on one tick, I'm just going to grab it. That's a really good one. So it's English Women's Clothing in the 19th Century by Willett Cunnington. So it's quite an old book now, but it still has a huge amount of information. And it has some really great fashion prints in it. The other thing is on archive, you can often get old journals, so Mode de la Fashion or Parisian journals from that period of time. And they are a fantastic resource of how they described fashion at that time, because you've got to remember, not like now where we can see an image or a video really readily available. They had to describe fashion in a way that people could actually imagine it. And so they're almost a bit like a catalogue. So they're really, really good.
Thank you. It's a good question from Jude, which is, what kind of boning is used in the cage arm plumpers?
So you could have had boning as in the traditional baleen. So baleen is a animal product. It's from the plankton filters of a whale, sort of quite often referred to as the teeth. And this was a fabulous material because it was quite strong, but it also molds to the heat of the body. So going on a tangent, in terms of stays, it's used and corsets, because baleen boning, it molds to the shape of the body with heat, and so it's quite comfortable. It's a bit like memory foam of the time, but it doesn't break and snap as easily. And when it does snap, you don't get these like sharp splinters. You also get cane, which is rush from plant fiber, and that if you moisten and wetten, and you can then pull it into a shape, and that's what you use in these. In terms of modern costuming, we use things like zip ties, which are actually a surprisingly good correlation to boning.
Thank you. Got a question from Marlene, which is, how did they adapt their style for specific occasions such as weddings or funerals?
Yeah, weddings and funerals. So weddings, you tended to wear your best dress, like your Sunday best, and that's your clean outfit. That's probably your newest outfit. It's the one that you don't wear as much. If you're much upper class, you're wearing the most fashionable outfit. If you're lower class, you're probably wearing your Sunday best, and that would have also been your wedding gown, was your Sunday best. You rarely had a gown made just for your wedding, because that's so impractical, especially when you think about the cost of fabric and just life back in general back then. A mourning, this is where we start to get really set principles for mourning and what you had to wear. So depending on who died, you have certain stages of mourning. So that could be a couple of days, it could be a couple of months, it could be, up to 3 years. This is for women. Men get it easy, they get like a couple of weeks and all they have to wear is a armband. But for women, you get stages of mourning. And so the first stage is black, and it's a very specific type of black. So it had to be non-reflective black. And so that rules out a lot of fabrics, but also a lot of trims. So you could have very dark, deep velvets, a very popular material called bombazine, which is a very matte, non-shiny material, like a bit like an almost an organza crepe. And then you can start to introduce, as you go along, other colors such as mauve, purple, grays, And then you go into half mourning, which is where you're in your purples, and then you eventually can go back into society with your normal clothing. The morning dress pattern fashion plate I showed a couple of slides ago, that's an example of dress not worn in the morning, but mourning with a U for observing a period of death. And you get a lot of ready-made morning wear starting to come out as well. So you could have dyed your own clothing and made it morning appropriate, but you could also now at this period go out and buy fabric specifically for morning, or get your dressmaker to make an item specifically for morning.
Interesting, thank you. So I think we might have one or two final questions from Pat Squared. So where were the clothes kept in the house? There doesn't seem to be any kind of wardrobes or closets as we know them today. So if the maid was coming to dress Anne and Anne, I presume, did they bring the clothes with them, or where were they kept?
Yeah, so very different to how we store clothing today is they didn't store them on hangers. I don't know exactly when a hanger was invented. I'll have to check on that one. But you tended to have items stored folded and in linen closets and chests. So at Shibden Hall, there's quite a few linen closets or chests where items were stored. And you would have had them wrapped in other layers of either fabric or paper, and with a lot of things to stop pests and potential moths. So lavender and like pomanders, and so it's like an orange with cloves stuck into it and all of that sort of thing. And there's a lot of airing out of clothing. So when you go from your summers to your winters, you're airing them out. So that's literally getting them out and giving them a shake and preparing them for the next season. And then in terms of wearing the clothing and laundering, it would have been outer garments were laundered as little as possible, and they often couldn't be laundered at all. Anne Lister's diaries often mentions her sitting at the table and brushing out her hem, and that was quite a laborious task of getting a brush and brushing out the dry mud. But your undergarments, which are the closest to your skin, they're the ones that are being more heavily laundered, and they would have been starched and then pressed. You also get linen presses, so having those really deep folds sometimes was quite a sort of almost a symbol of wealth, because you could afford your items to be pressed. So that's where you get linen pressed as well.
Great. The Pats did have their hand up for quite a bit. Did you have another question you wanted to ask? I think that's
The
you.
large puffed sleeves, did the overcoats, in the Regency, you had a police. Did they continue with this police, and how did they accommodate those sleeves?
You sort of squish it in.
Oh, really?
It
Oh,
works. So your police tends to have a much wider opening.
uh-huh.
And if you're using one of the sort of more caged sleeves, then you can it just sort of squishes in, if that makes sense. Or if you knew you were going out, you might have removed the sleeve puff so that when you're out, you didn't have that in there. A lot of the outer fabric tends to be much more structured and heavier, so it keeps that puff more so. And police, it's sort of a more interchangeable term. We get polices into the 1830s, and it's sort of more like a jacket.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is it for questions, unless anyone has anything else. We do have a little bit of time still, if anyone's got any extra questions. That looks like it might be it.